All right, so by my clock, it is 4 o'clock. So with that said, we're going to start on time. So welcome to Access Missouri's video call on voting and what's happening out there today in our state. A lot, as our speakers will fill you in as we move forward. So I want to thank our speakers first up front for being here. And we will be taking questions in the chat. So if you don't know how to turn your chat on, go down to the bottom of the screen, click on chat. It'll populate on the right-hand side, and you'll be able to see the chat. You'll be able to see every question that people post and the responses to those questions. So we'll go from there in terms of the chat room, and we'll try to get those questions answered at the end. But don't hesitate. You can always send in follow-up emails, and we'll get answers to you. Obviously, we're starting on time at 4, and we are scheduled to end at 5. But if you do have additional questions, some of our speakers have indicated they're willing to stay after. So feel free to stay on at the end of the call when it officially ends, and we'll try to get to everybody's questions at that point. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker. That's Maharat Roy Picker-Nice. Roy is the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis and the recipient of the 2020 Teruah Rabbinic Human Rights Hero Award. Did I get that right, Rory?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to you to share a little bit about your background and how you're involved in this work.
Sure. So as you heard, I'm Rory. I run the Jewish Community Relations Council here in St. Louis, and wanted to also really frame this with some words of text in terms of thinking about how it is that we approach this work. I think it's really interesting. So many of you know we have a weekly portion of the Torah that we read every week. This week's Torah portion is called Korach. And in this week's Torah portion, it uses 3 different words for community, which is really significant because the way that the Torah is written, we find every word to have meaning to it. And so there's 3 different words that get used to talk about the people. One is Edah, one is Kahal, and one is Am. And in some ways, they each become more expansive. So which is nation, is perhaps kind of the largest of the words that we understand, right? What it is to be part of a people is to be part of a nation. And this is something that you don't necessarily have to do anything to belong, right? It might just be by the nature of your birth, or maybe because of where you've chosen to live, right? Somehow you find yourself in a space, and because of that, you are part of this group of people. That's different than the word that we have, kahal, which comes from the root to gather. Literally, it translates as congregation, right? Somehow there is an identity that comes because we choose to be in physical proximity, which feels a little funny to say now as we're not really joining people in physical proximity, but we've also adjusted for virtual proximity, right? But there's something about, we kind of opt into spaces because we choose to enter into them. And even in those spaces, we can have broad disagreements with people, variety of political views or belief systems, right? But we've chosen to enter into a space because there's something about being part of a larger group. And then the most narrowly defined, which comes up more frequently is in this week's Torah portion, is Edah. Edah comes from the root aid, which means to witness, like to testify. Right? This is a group that comes together for a shared cause. Somehow there's a group that's trying to advocate for change, and in advocating for change, they choose to band together. This is the most narrowly defined definition, but in some ways I think maybe the strongest definition, right, of what it is, because this is a group that doesn't just find themselves together, but it's a group that's opted in together. I think this is really significant as we think about the work and where we're going to be going in terms of the rest of this conversation, that we find ourselves really looking at all of these definitions, right? What does it mean for all of us to be citizens of a country, to be part of this widespread community for a variety of reasons? However we found ourselves here we are, and somehow we're part of this nation as being part of the American people. There is a physical proximity of coming together, of being part of living in the same region with one another, of working together with one another, but most significantly of what it is to come together around a specific cause, to speak up and to share our voices. But what I think is especially noteworthy with the word Ada is that, like I said, the root of it comes from aid, of witness, of testimony. There has to, it's not something that could ever be passive. There has to be something active. There has to be a way for one's voices to be heard. And I think that's where voting becomes the most crucial element in all of it, that if we don't have a pathway for people to actually express their voices, then there's no way to enter into the group. There's no way to actually join together, and there's no way to then ultimately advocate for that change. And so I think the work that's happening here, the work that's being done by all of you, I think is just so significant for our world today, because what it's doing is not only is it preserving what it is to be American, it's preserving what it is for us to be able to gather together as a people, but it's also preserving the voice of all people to then advocate as Americans, as people in physical proximity, towards the world that we believe that it should be. So I'm just really grateful to all of you, and really grateful for the work that continues to inspire that every day.
Thank you, Rory. So now I'm going to start our program. We have two great speakers, and our first one is Denise Lieberman. Denise is the General Counsel to the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition and is a nationally recognized expert on voting rights. She also teaches, you still teach at WashU, yes, at the law school?
I do.
Or undergrad.
Both.
She's also my cousin, so it's really cool that we get to work together as well. And then Michael Wolf, who is a former Missouri Supreme Court Justice and Dean Emeritus of the St. Louis University Law School. And they're going to talk to us about the status of voting in Missouri for the upcoming August and November elections. And I'm going to ask Denise to start to update us on the lawsuit that Missouri Voter Protection Coalition and the NAACP filed in the Missouri Supreme Court, correct? Regarding the use of notaries and absentee ballots. And Denise, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and thanks for organizing this. And thank you, Rory, for that introduction. I think it really helps set the tone for this conversation. I really appreciate that. My name's Denise Lieberman. I'm the General Counsel to the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is a nonpartisan statewide network of voter advocates that have collaborated together since 2006 to protect the right to vote in Missouri and to identify and eliminate barriers to voting. And our organization includes a wide array of groups and organizations, from civil rights organizations to labor folks to students to seniors to environmentalists to faith-based organizations, including NCJW, the JCRC, several temples in our area, and a number of other multi-faith organizations. And I think that that's really pertinent to your introduction, Rory, because the work that we do, while many people think about voting rights and elections as grounded in partisanship and politics, the truth of the matter is that this work transcends partisan politics, because it truly is about whether or not we have a voice. Our vote is the structural mechanism that society has that gives us a voice, that gives us a say in matters that affect us. Ultimately, it is how we exercise self-determination about things that matter to us in our communities. And that's one reason you're seeing protests out on the streets right now, because it is people trying to exercise a voice, people who have felt silenced. The vote is a structural way that we have a voice, and it is the societal way that we confer dignity to all people. And that grounds our work. Now, what we're talking about here today, I want to start by saying today, June 23rd, is the start of absentee voting here in Missouri for the August 4th elections. And so starting today, you can begin to cast an absentee ballot in person or by mail. I'm going to show just a couple of quick slides if I can. Where did
You
they
can.
go?
I made you a co-host so you
Thank
can do
you.
that.
Okay. I'm going to try and do this real quick to ensure that, that Justice Wolf has. And so what I want to say here about absentee voting and voting by mail, that's the thing everybody has a question about. The challenge that we've had here in Missouri compared to other states is that unlike the vast majority of states, Missouri does not typically allow people to vote absentee, allow them to skip the polling place unless they have one of a very limited number of reasons or excuses to skip the polling place, right? And that's one of the reasons we filed a lawsuit. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, the ACLU, brought a lawsuit on behalf of the NAACP and the League of Women Voters, arguing that even with our very limited number of excuses, that one of those excuses that allows people to vote absentee due to illness or confinement should apply to anybody practicing social distancing in the wake of this pandemic. Uh-oh, this is not letting me move. As a result, lawmakers began paying attention, finally, even though we've been advocating for vote by mail measures for some time. And on the final day of the legislative session, passed a new law that does two things. And I'm gonna keep this real top level here to make sure there's plenty of time. This new law does two things. It adds one new reason to vote absentee to the existing 6 reasons we have to vote absentee already. And that is for someone that has or is in an at-risk category for catching or transmitting COVID-19. Those folks can now also vote absentee in 2020 without having to get that ballot notarized. The second thing this new law does is it allows any other voter in Missouri to cast a mail-in ballot, but those ballots must be notarized. And that's part of the concern, because we know that if it is improper to require people to choose between their safety and going to a polling place to exercise their right to vote, then it is also improper to make people choose between their safety and their right to vote by having to go out physically and find someone to notarize a ballot. And that's because absentee ballots cannot be notarized remotely. I don't know why this is not working. So this is the new form that exists. You can select either an absentee ballot or a mail-in ballot if you wish to vote remotely. If you select an absentee ballot, that you will need to list one of the reasons. Okay, if you do not check one of the reasons, your request for a ballot will be rejected. If you are requesting a mail-in ballot, you simply need to check the box that you are requesting a mail-in ballot. This form does need to be signed, and it needs to be submitted to your local election authority. So let's get into this real quick about what the new measure does. Here are the reasons to vote absentee. You can vote absentee for 7 different reasons now in the state of Missouri, but 2 of those reasons do not require you to have that ballot notarized and are probably reasons that many people are likely to select due to the pandemic. Either that you are expect to be incapacitated or confined due to illness or disability, or you are a caretaker for somebody who is. Those ballots do not need to be notarized. And also for an election that occurs in 2020, if you are an at-risk category for COVID-19. Now, who are those folks? Those include, and these are folks who can cast an absentee ballot without a notary, anybody over the age of 65, anybody in a long-term care facility, anyone with chronic lung disease, including moderate to severe asthma, anyone with a serious heart condition, anyone who's immunocompromised, anyone with diabetes, liver disease, chronic kidney disease, and is on dialysis. Okay, and so that's a fairly large group of people, but it doesn't include everybody. And that is why our lawsuit still remains live, right? Because if you do not fall into these 2 categories, or you're not on the permanent absentee list, and you wish to cast a mail-in ballot, either absentee or by mail, under current law, you will have to get that ballot notarized. And so our lawsuit is currently pending before the Missouri Supreme Court. We had oral arguments there last Monday, and we are expecting, anxiously awaiting a decision and expecting a ruling at any time. Part of our argument initially was that voters should not be have to choose between their safety and their right to vote by going to a crowded polling place. In addition, voters should not have to choose between their safety and their right to vote by leaving their home and going to a business and being in close proximity to a notary. But we are gearing up, just in case we are not successful, with a plan to coordinate groups that are organizing notary services with people who are notaries. We've already had over 350 people sign up for this Notary Hub. If you are interested in getting further information about the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, I'm gonna just jump to the final thing here. You can text MOVPC to 66866, and I will stop there.
That was really a good summary. I had very little to add other than, let me just give you just a little bit of history about this. There are very, very few instances of prosecutions for voter fraud based upon people asking for an absentee ballot. In fact, in his 28 years as a prosecuting attorney for St. Louis County, there were 0 such prosecutions. So there is absentee ballot fraud, as we've seen in a number of cases, but it's very rare, very isolated. And prior to the law, a memo that I and 80 other lawyers signed to the local election authorities, urging them to interpret the confinement due to illness to include people who did not, as Denise described, did not wish to come to a polling place and expose themselves to a virus that is quite insidious in that people who are able to transmit the virus may not have any symptoms. And I think we have to be concerned not only for people who vote, but I did vote in person on June 2nd. I was one of 3 voters at Wydown Middle School at 7 a.m. And I always lower the average age when I walk into that room because the people who work the polling places are older than I, and I'm well within your at-risk group, by the way, of being over 65. But prior to all of that, the St. Louis County Election Board, quite remarkably, sent out to every voter in St. Louis County over the age of 65. I think that was the group they were sending it to because I got one. An application for an absentee ballot for June, August, and November. So they were already on this. A number of local election authorities were already amenable to interpreting the law that way because their job, as they see it, and they are in most of our counties, they're the county clerk. We call them the local election authorities, but frankly, that's only a small part of their job. They want people to vote, and they are elected for the purpose of doing that. So, and then there's only a few counties like St. Louis City, St. Louis County, and Jackson County and Kansas City, where there is a board that decides these things. But I think that there was some recognition that in the current circumstances that existing law would be sufficient. That's what, as Denise says, is that issue in the lawsuit that they've filed. There's 3 different possibilities, it seems to me, from the standpoint of that lawsuit. One is we win. And by the way, I was happy to be local counsel on a brief that was prepared by the Wilmer Hale firm, and they had 11 epidemiologists and doctors of medicine, infectious disease mostly, on there as an amicus brief, explaining to the court just how insidious and how contagious this virus is. So number 1 is we win. Number 2 is we lose. And that is that subsection 2 that Denise had up on the board does not include people who are afraid to come to the polls because they, even though asymptomatic, they should be confined due to illness. The third possibility is that the court doesn't decide it, which leaves us kind of in limbo, which is kind of where we were before. That may have the effect of leaving it up to the local election authorities as to how they are going to interpret the law. Now, no local election authority has the wherewithal to investigate, quote, voter fraud. They can refer to the local prosecutor. Local prosecutors have murderers, rapists, robbers, etc. they're not terribly interested in people who just tried to vote. Okay, so that's a practical thing. It's really hard to say that to the public, though, because there's a whole lot of people on the right side of the political aisle who are trying to convince them that they that if they vote absentee, that it's going to be voter fraud. So we have a lot at stake in this decision. Don't get me wrong, but it seems to me that there are some instances where people should list themselves as being unavailable to vote in person because they are confined due to illness. And it may be people other than those in that list that the legislature just passed. And by the way, Denise, that law that they passed only applies this year. So it's not a permanent solution. If you win your lawsuit on the point about confined due to illness, that would include COVID, it goes beyond this year. It goes for future elections. So I think it's a big deal. And it really comes down to splitting some hairs about, it doesn't say I'm confined due to my illness. I'm confined due to illness. Not even a illness or an illness, but illness. Well, there is an illness out there, and I am confined in the sense of wearing a mask and not showing up and doing these things and all the things that you talked about. So we're hopeful, but when this ruling comes out, however it comes out, I'm really happy to see that there are people really anxious and eager to get the word out to people as to how to vote. I mean, the important thing is that we get the turnout up. I might also add, for some people who are wary about going to the polls on election day, especially in November when one would think that it might be crowded, and that is, you can vote absentee if you're absent from the county on election day. And I did this many times when I worked in Jefferson City when I was on the Missouri Supreme Court. I'd be gone on election day. So I would go to the election authority, which I think is now Northwest Plaza. They moved it from Sunnon. And I just simply filled out the thing and just voted. There was almost never a line or a crowd or anything like that. So that's a possibility for people, not a terribly good one compared to voting by mail in some way that Denise has described. So thank you for having me. Guess we'll have some questions and some more speakers too.
Right, so Denise, do you have anything you need to add before we go to some Q&A?
I can probably cover things in the Q&A if
Okay.
people want further explanation.
Great.
Some of the deadlines or the difference between mail-in ballots and absentee ballots.
Okay, great. So if you all could start posting your questions in the chat. I'm going to turn it over to Julia Greensfelder. She's going to moderate the Q&A for us for the next 10 minutes or so. So Julia, you're on. If you could unmute, we're good to go.
Great. Thank you so much, Ellen. So I have two questions so far that Denise already answered in the chat, but I figure multiple people have these same questions. So the first one is, what is the difference between absentee ballots and mail-in ballots?
It's a really great question, and I didn't get too into the weeds in my initial presentation because I thought people might ask about that. The truth of the matter is that they're going to look exactly the same. It's basically an absentee ballot, right? Missouri is not one of the 5 states that uses mail-in voting where they actually mail ballots to you. That's not what we're talking about. We're just calling these mail-in ballots, even though they're basically absentee ballots. But there are slightly different rules with respect to how we have to request those ballots and how we have to turn in those ballots once we are done voting. And in both absentee and mail-in ballots, regardless of how you want to vote by mail, whether you can list one of those reasons or whether you don't have a reason, you have to request the ballot ahead of time. It will not be mailed to you automatically. Okay, and that form that I showed you in my slides is available on the Secretary of State's website and your local election authority. Many of you are likely in St. Louis County, but there are 116 local election authorities, and the forms will be on their websites as well. The difference is, if you're voting absentee, you have to list one of the reasons. There are 7 reasons that you can vote absentee. 2 of them do not require a notary, as we talked about before. You have to list one of those reasons. If you're voting by mail, you simply need to check that you want to vote by mail. The difference is, that when you turn this in, and you got to turn it into your local election authority, the Secretary of State's office cannot take it, process it, or transfer it as they do in other states, unfortunately. If you're requesting an absentee ballot, you can submit that request over email, which for some is quite a bit easier. You can also submit it by fax. You can also send it in the mail, or you can drop it off in person. You can also vote absentee in person if you wish. If what you're requesting is a mail-in ballot, the only way you can get that request in is through the mail, or if you go and you hand it in person. Similarly, after you get the ballot and you've cast your ballot and you're done voting, you put those ballots into an outer envelope that the state will send you. It's postage prepaid, but you do have to complete the form that's on that outer envelope, where you have to indicate the reason you're voting absentee if you are, or that you're voting by mail. You have to sign it. And here's the kicker. These ballots have to be in the hands of your local election authority by close of polls on election day, not postmarked. So this is an area where we're going to really have our work cut out for us in terms of our education, folks, because many people are going to think, the weekend before, oh, maybe I'll fill out my ballot and stick it in the mail. It probably won't get there by Tuesday. So people are going to have to be on top of this. Here's the difference, though, between absentee and mail-in ballots. If you're one of those people that procrastinates like I do, last-ditch scenario, you can go turn that absentee ballot in person at your election authority. Heck, if you didn't even bother casting it, you could show up at your polling place, spoil that ballot, and vote a regular ballot that day at the polls. That's not going to be true with mail-in ballots. The only way you can turn that completed ballot in to the election authority is through the Postal Service. Is through the
Which,
mail.
by the way, a certain president wants to defund. Which leads to another thing that I think people have to be watching for. As Denise mentioned, there's 116 local election authorities, all but 4 of which are just individual persons or a county clerk with maybe a deputy, and they have a lot of other things to do. They are used to having elections where somewhere around 5% of the people vote by absentee. It's going to be a lot bigger. And I'm not so sure that these folks are ready for the volume that they're going to encounter. And I'm not so sure how good they are going to be at getting votes counted. So I think that the people who wish to throw confusion into our election system are going to have a field day, because we are basically, if you love the revenue, the license plate offices, if you like the license plate offices, you will love the local election authorities, okay? I mean, and God love them, because they're doing their best and they really are trying to help people vote, but they don't get very much training, they don't get very much backup. And in the bill that just passed, the legislature gave the Secretary of State some authority to investigate, quote, voter fraud, which of course he's interested in doing. Now, fortunately, they didn't give him any money to do that, and so he doesn't have any staff to do that. But the other thing that I don't think he has done, and I think it's something that is critical, is that they've got money at the Secretary of State's budget, federal money, to help people vote. And Denise, maybe I don't know, that they're going to spend it on this. And they've created for themselves, the legislature have, a Hancock Amendment problem. I don't want to get into the weeds about that, but fundamentally, when the state tells a local authority to do something, it has to give that authority money to spend to do it. And they didn't do that this time. So there's probably going to be a bunch of hassles about what's done. So I think the issues that I'm raising, you're going to hear a lot about them. Don't worry about them. Just get people the ballots, get them to voting. The people like Denise and the people on her team will sort it out. We don't have to march on the local election authorities. They're going to be stressed enough, but I think that you have to assume, and I do, because I've dealt with them a fair amount, that they act in good faith.
Absolutely. Yeah. Uh, we'll have, you know, I think one thing that this pandemic has really made clear for so many people who maybe were just sort of not experiencing any problems voting before is how antiquated Missouri's rules are, right? We wouldn't have had to go through any of this if we were part of the majority of states that have no excuse absentee voting. And, you know, our lawmakers have had proposals to do that on their plate for a decade, proposals that have been endorsed by Republican and Democratic election officials, right? And at the federal level, there is legislation. It's passed the House. It's called the HEROES Act. It would provide $3.6 billion in elections infrastructure to allow states, to give states the funds that are needed to ramp up. And Judge Wolf is absolutely right. The vast majority of the burden is falling on the shoulders of those local election authorities. And so Congress needs to appropriate those funds. We are in the middle of a big campaign to target Senator Blunt because he's a critical vote on this. He's a critical influencer on the Finance Committee. And also to make sure that Secretary of Ashcroft actually releases those funds to the local election authorities when they come in, because they are really shouldering quite a bit with all the added paper and added mail that comes out of this process.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Denise and Michael. And I'm going to pass it back to Ellen to introduce our next batch of speakers. Denise and Michael, if I just send you the list of the questions that you haven't yet answered, could you answer them in the chat?
Sure.
Great. Thank you.
Julia, thank you. Judge Wolf, Denise, thank you so much for your insight. Clearly, we got a lot of work to do in Missouri, and thank you for leading that charge. We really appreciate it. So I want to remind everybody on the call that this call is being sponsored by Access Missouri, and Access Missouri is a pro-reproductive health care PAC that supports candidates in our region. And with that said, I know Vicki Singer posted the link in the chat room. I wouldn't be doing my job if I asked you to donate to Access Missouri so we can support more candidates like the two that you are going to meet in a few minutes. So I'm going to start with our current state auditor, Nicole Galloway. She is the independent watchdog for taxpayers in Missouri, and she is the only woman and Democrat elected to statewide office, and she is running to unseat our anti-reproductive health care Governor Parson, and who signed an abortion ban into law in Missouri. And so we're hoping to help Nicole get elected as our first female governor in Missouri's history. And Nicole, I saw you on here and you're unmuted, so I'm going to turn it over to you. And when you are done, we are going to hear from Yinka Folletti, who is a pro-reproductive healthcare candidate for Missouri Secretary of State, and hopefully he'll do all the things that Ashcroft is not doing when he gets elected. Yinka is an immigrant American, a West Point grad, a U.S. Army veteran, and former executive director at Forward Through Ferguson. So Nicole, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you turn it over to Yinka when you are done. Okay?
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Ellen, very much. Yeah, thank you. It's great to see you all in this call. And thanks for allowing me to be here. I really do appreciate it. And, you know, I'm so glad that even during COVID, we're finding ways to connect with each other. Because I think for a lot of folks, the last thing that they're really thinking about is partisan politics these days. But I do know that people are realizing more and more that it does matter who we elect to leadership positions, especially governor, because never before has it been so clear that the decisions our governors make have such a dramatic impact on our day-to-day lives. And what I find so troubling about Governor Parson's conduct is that he was slow to take the steps necessary to keep the public safe. He passed the buck to local leaders, and only seems to act when he couldn't bear criticism and can't bear pressure any longer. We are very much in the middle of this public health crisis and staring down a long road to recovery. And this recovery is going to be harder than in other states because of the years of policies that have come out of Jefferson City. We need to dig our way out of this. We have to help people get back to work, help people stay in their homes, help people afford their basic expenses. And so make no mistake about what's on the ballot this November. The virus, the response to it, the recovery from it, it will be a defining issue of our times. And if we're going to get back on our feet, come out ahead, get back to work, we have to start moving in a new direction. And as you all know, I'm running for governor to put Jefferson City back on the side of working families. Now more than ever, it's so important to have a government that leaves no one behind as we begin this long road to recovery. Parson is part of the old way of doing things, where the well-connected get what they want, while regular folks don't get what they need. On healthcare, on education, on public safety, his priorities are all wrong. And when it comes to his misplaced priorities, just look at Governor Parson's biggest accomplishment so far as governor, HB 126, and his effort to close the St. Louis Planned Parenthood Clinic. And I do believe that without an electoral consequence, Governor Parson will accelerate his extreme anti-choice agenda, including making Missouri the only state without a provider where a woman can access her constitutional right to choose since Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973. A Parson election means Dr. Williams remains as a health director, continuing to weaponize his department in service of a far-right political agenda. I think Governor Parson will interpret a mandate to continue down this extreme path. I have not been shy about this issue. In fact, I made Parson's support of HB 126 a part of my campaign launch. It's why I was endorsed early on by Emily's List and Planned Parent Advocates and NARAL and your organization. And I'm thankful for that because you know the stakes. I think as we look ahead over the final few months of this campaign, if you can imagine, there's only 4 months until Election Day, that the biggest issue we face is voter participation in the midst of this ongoing public health crisis. This is a ticking time bomb, and we have to sound the alarm, and we have to do it early, and we have to do it often. I know that you just had an excellent conversation with experts on this issue. But I do want to remind folks that before our June elections across Missouri, Governor Parson told people not to go out and vote. And he said that while a bill providing an expansion of absentee voting was sitting on his desk awaiting his signature. He doesn't want people to vote, and the reasons are very clear. He knows that when our voice is heard at the ballot box, we are going to seize control of our own futures from the insiders that have the power in Jefferson City. You know, Parson knows that Missouri is likely to vote in favor of Medicaid expansion in August. And so it was going to be on the ballot with him in November, but he also knows that Medicaid expansion is more popular than he is. And so he moved it to the August ballot in the hopes that it would help himself politically and that it would be more challenging for the proponents of the campaign to get a success in the August election. I personally think that it will win anyway in Missouri because Missourians want health care. But then as we have seen, Parson has a track record of thinking he knows better than the voters. You just have to have history be our guide here on Clean Missouri, on right to work, on puppy mill legislation from years ago. Parson thinks he knows better than you. And so when you vote to expand Medicaid, you better believe it matters who is sitting in the governor's office next year when it comes time to implement it. But in order to accomplish this and more, we have to be able to vote. It is the most powerful tool that we have. You know, Parson didn't sign the bill that allows Missouri's voter to vote absentee without an excuse in August and November of this year. And it is a start, but it is not the goal. We have to get rid of the notary requirement. I know we're waiting for a decision from the Supreme Court, and hopefully it will come this week. But whatever happens in expansion of absentee voting, if it's good enough in 2020, it should be good enough forever. And Parson opposes expansion of voting rights, and I will certainly fight for it. Your support in this campaign means a lot to me. I'm so glad to be with you and looking forward to working together towards a victory in 2020. And I'm also so pleased that we have Yinka on the call with us. He is a fantastic and phenomenal candidate for Secretary of State. He shares your values of expanding access to the ballot and protecting women's reproductive freedoms and healthcare. And I'm so glad that he is running and is on the ticket this year in November.
Thanks, Nicole. Yinka, it's all yours. But I just want to take 2 seconds to acknowledge Representative Trish Gunby, who is on the call wave. Trish, let everybody know you're here. And thank you for joining us. So Yinka, it's all yours.
All right, terrific. Well, thank you so much, Alan, thank you for to Access Mo for all of your leadership, for everything that you do each and every day to ensure reproductive health care rights and voter rights for all Missourians. My name is Yinka Falati. I am the Democratic nominee for Missouri Secretary of State. I've secured the Democratic nomination. So in November, it'll be me for Democrats and it'll be Jay Ashcroft for Republicans. When I think about voting rights and reproductive health care rights for all Missourians, this is personal for me. That's because I both had to earn my right to vote and I fought to defend it for all Americans. You see, I immigrated to our country from Lagos, Nigeria when I was 7 years old, and I had to earn my citizenship. It wasn't given to me, I had to earn it. And so by earning my citizenship, I had to earn my right to vote and also had to earn my appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And after the 4 years at West Point, I graduated in 1998 and was commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Army, specifically in the armor branch. So I served on tanks and in tank units my entire 6 years plus on active duty. 2 tours to Kuwait. The first was to keep Saddam Hussein in check, and the second one was to defend our country after 9/11. I realized when I was serving very much that I was signing a blank check. I knew very well what was involved. I knew the occupational hazards, and I knew that my fellow soldiers, sailors, airmen, women, Marines were also signing a blank check. We knew what was involved when we swore an oath to defend the Constitution of our country. I and we didn't do that so that only some Americans could vote. I and we didn't do that so that only men could have reproductive health care freedom. No, I signed up so that every American could have the right to vote. I signed up so that women also could have reproductive health care freedom. I grew up in a house with 4 younger sisters. My dad and I were the only males in the house. And so you can imagine we never got to watch what we wanted to watch on TV. We didn't win that battle. But it's very personal to me. And I also I'm married with 4 daughters and 3 daughters, 4 children, 3 daughters. And so I want to ensure that all of my sisters and my daughters have reproductive healthcare freedom, that they're not stifled, that their rights are not trampled upon. So this is very, very personal to me. This is what I signed up for when I was defending the country. And I want to live in a Missouri where we have that freedom that our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marine and women are fighting for. I want to live in a Missouri where women have reproductive healthcare freedom, where they get to make decisions informed by their healthcare professionals without intrusion from state or federal government. That's the kind of Missouri that we can have. Imagine a Missouri where we're not having state officials tracking women's periods. Imagine a Missouri where women get to make their own decisions about their own bodies. Imagine a Missouri where we're not having only some of the people being able to vote. Imagine a Missouri where the government is actually promoting democracy, inspiring people to get engaged. Imagine a Missouri where people want to be engaged and have the freedom to get engaged and don't have to navigate a complicated chart. I applaud Denise Lieberman's mastery of and Judge Wolf's mastery of everything that goes into voting this August and November. But my goodness, it ought not be that complicated. This is our fundamental right. And that's what I'm fighting for. And that's why I'm running for Missouri Secretary of State. So as I close, I think we can all agree that the events of the last several weeks and the last several months have highlighted to all of us how imperative it is to have leaders of character and competence in our federal government and leaders of character and competence in our state government. And that is what I am working to do, to bring back to Jefferson City as Missouri's next Secretary of State. I'd be honored to have your support. Thank you so much.
Thanks to both of you. I'm going to turn it back over to Julia to moderate the questions. If you all have questions for either candidate, please feel free to drop them into the chat, and we'll go from there.
Great. So it doesn't look like we have any questions in the chat yet, but if anyone would like to raise their hand, it's in the participant section. We can also just call on you and you can ask your question directly.
So I will ask both of you, you know, we're running a PAC, so we have donated and agreed to support both of your campaigns. What does it cost to run a governor's race? What does it cost to run a Secretary of State's race?
A lot. You know, in this campaign in total, we'll raise about $10 million. We are about halfway there, so we're right on track. Last quarter, we outraised Parson 2-1. We're on track to do that again. We have our fundraising deadline on June 30th. We'll report how fundraising for the campaign is going. And, you know, that includes not just my campaign, but the coordinated campaign, the effort to get Democrats elected up and down the ballot, from Yinka to Trish to other local candidates, Deb Lavender, everyone in between. And, you know, particularly on this issue of accessing the ballot, a big part of the coordinated campaign is going to be a voter protection arm to ensure that everybody's following the rules, that people can request an absentee ballot, that if there's going to be a notary, they get it notarized, that we follow the rules there, and that it's sent in and that it is counted. That is going to be a huge part of this coordinated campaign. Voter turnout is supposed to be pretty darn high in November. And so if turnout is high and people are motivated to vote, we have to ensure as Democrats and as part of the coordinated campaign that people have a way to access the ballot and have their vote counted.
Great. And real quickly, before Yinka hops in, we have a number of questions now, so it'd be great so we could get through all of them if you could keep your answers relatively brief. Thank you so much, Yinka. We look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. We have to raise not quite as much as Nicole, but we've got to raise a sizable amount. You know, we're going up against a dynastic name like Ashcroft, and so the hill is steep. We've got to raise generally between 1.1 and 1.3 million to be in a position to win. So if each of you on this call would write a check for about $250,000 each, I think we could get there very, very quickly. But in all seriousness, as Nicole said, we've got to work together. And so the coordinated campaign is very, very important. We encourage you all to support that because that helps us combine our efforts, pool our efforts, and work more efficiently and reach the entire state. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Yinka. This next one actually I think is more aimed at you as well. And it's, can you give some examples of how the current Secretary of State is blocking legislation? And if Nicole, you wanted to jump in, maybe how Governor Parson is blocking legislation as well.
Yeah, so you might recall that about a month ago or so, our state legislature passed that limited vote by mail measure before the governor signed it weeks later. And on the same day that the legislature passed that measure, you had Ashcroft coming out in writing against vote by mail. So let's pause on that. During the most lethal and dangerous health pandemic in 100 years, you have the person who's supposed to be the defender of democracy, who's supposed to be the caretaker of democracy in our state, coming out in writing saying he's against vote by mail. That's completely dangerous to democracy, and that's just a prime example of the kinds of things he's been against. He's also been against, remember, we had our Supreme Court strike down the photo voter ID law. He was in favor of that law that would have made it harder for people to vote, that would have erected an artificial barrier. So generally, Ashcroft has not been in favor of democracy or been in favor of making sure more Missourians are able to vote.
Thank you, Yinka. Nicole, would you like to jump in at all?
I mean, Parson is pretty much in lockstep with the Republican agenda. You know, in the Republican Party platform that was passed, they want to do voter ID. They want to overturn Clean Missouri. Part of their statewide platform is to make access to the ballot through the initiative petition process harder. If you look at our agenda, it is increased education, funding for education. It is Medicaid expansion and making healthcare more affordable, working people issues. So when Parson stands up at the statewide meeting, they're all in lockstep with the same agenda of making it harder for people's voice to be heard at the ballot box through multiple ways.
Yeah, and if I may, Julia, this is an important point. Last summer, I think most of us were here in the state when we witnessed firsthand Ashcroft. Remember that no bans on choice would be referendum on women's reproductive rights, and we watched as Ashcroft, through procedural machinations of his office, literally sat on that referendum and completely prevented it from being able to get the signatures to even have the opportunity to get on the ballot. I mean, that's the kind of nonsense that he has been using the power of his office to do instead of promoting greater access to healthcare and greater access to voting.
Thank you, Yinka, for that addition. So our next question is very topical. As you're out campaigning, have you had lots of questions about defunding the police, and would you speak to that, both of you?
Yeah, and I can go first. You know, the questions that I have received are more along the lines of, what does defunding the police mean? And, you know, rarely do I speak with anyone that says, yes, we want to abolish or dismantle our law enforcement services or our police forces. You know, what I see here is that budgets are about priorities, and we have not prioritized so many things. And, you know, first of all, you can't fix what you don't recognize. You can't address what you don't say. And so we have to say that racism is real, that there are injustices and inequalities in our institutions. And the killing of George Floyd have ripped open very painful wounds that have existed for a long time here in Missouri. And what I don't want to have happen is that, and it's what politicians do. They have one quick fix. They say, we can do something immediately now. And then they pat themselves on the back and say, we're done. We've done it. We've accomplished criminal justice reform. That is it. You know, that's not acceptable. We have not properly funded our education system. People do not have access to health care. There are true racial disparities in our healthcare systems and in our institutions. And until we start to address the longer institutional issues on this long road to change, we're going to be back in the same dang position. So there absolutely are things that we can do in the short term, in the near term, but we cannot lose sight of the long path that we are on. And we can't just say we're done with one small change. You know, I know that this, Yinka worked on Ford through Ferguson, and he talked about that a little bit in his introductory remarks. And so, you know, I will certainly yield my time that we have, so Yinka can talk about this through his personal, but also through the work that he has done throughout St. Louis for years now.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. You know, this is the issue of our times. It's the issue, it's the elephant in our country. And it's not just in Ferguson in 2014 vis-a-vis Michael Brown Jr. It's George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the countless other names, too long list of names. And when people say defund the police, you know, you hear this phrase, and that phrase sounds extreme, because people really don't want no form of protection when they need 911. They want people to be able to respond. What people are saying is, let's reallocate some of the funding. less than 10% of what police actually respond to is violent crime. Less than 10% of what police actually respond to is violent crime. Most of what our police are responding to are issues that are incident to a lack of equity in education, issues that are incident to lack of proper mental health care, issues that are incident to transportation, issues that are incident to homelessness. As Nicole intimated, I served as the executive director of Forward Through Ferguson, and in that work, the work of the Ferguson Commission was to work for nearly a year and study all of the underlying issues that could have led to something, the shooting of Michael Brown Jr. happening. And we know that at the root of so much of this is the racial inequity in our region, in our state, and in our country. And so when we talk about defunding police, when people talk about that, I don't think they mean that in a literal sense. Most people do not. Most people do not in a literal sense. But what people are saying is let us place priority on these other issues, and we wouldn't need the police to respond to homelessness. We wouldn't need the police to respond to mental health issues because they're not equipped for that. They're equipped for other things. So that's the kind of conversations that I'm having with people as we're going along the campaign trail.
Great, thank you so much, Yinka and Nicole. So we have one final question and then Ellen will close. Given we only have 4 minutes left, if you could keep your answers kind of brief. The last question is, what are your greatest challenges right now? And I will add, how can we help you in addition to donating, of course?
You know, I think that the biggest challenge right now is knowing how people are going to access the ballot and moving forward with the coordinated campaign that I spoke about. We are going to need volunteers. We are just going to need volunteers. And what volunteering looks like might look different than previous elections because we might be in a situation where folks are not knocking on doors or answering doors due to COVID. And so we have to be flexible in what our get out the vote efforts are going to look like. You know, I joke around that part of this is like rebuilding an airplane mid-air and still landing the plane one Tuesday in November. And so access to the ballot is going to be critical here. So you can go to NicoleGalloway.com/volunteer. You can go to Show Me Change, where the coordinated campaign is housed. Sign up to volunteer, be willing to volunteer, and be flexible in what you're asked to do, given that we are dealing with a pandemic.
Yeah, I echo all that Nicole shared. I would say our greatest challenge is the age-old challenge of fundraising. You know, we're working very, very hard. Again, the hill is steep. We have no misgivings about how difficult this will be. And to be in the greatest position to win, we've got to have the resources. And so we need your continued help. Thank you to so many of you on the screen who have contributed, but to your friends and colleagues who have not, we need your help, and we can do this. And so that's the biggest challenge. And of course, campaigning during a COVID environment is a little bit of uncharted territory. There is no playbook for that. We're flying the plane as we're building it. We put some links in the chat, so please take a look at the links in the chat. You can engage with our campaign. You can sign up to help, and you can sign up to contribute. Thank you both so much. So I just want to call everybody's attention that first of all, Access Missouri has information on all of our endorsed candidates and their campaigns. So to date, that includes Nicole Galloway, Nicole, Yinka, Doug Beck, Dev Lavender, and Trish Gumby. And you can find more on all of them at the accessmo.today website. And hopefully you'll share that with family and friends. I do want to call out some comments that were posted at the end, both from Judge Wolf and from Denise Lieberman, about the need for poll workers and to get young people out there and working the polls, about the need, especially in the county, to talk to county council members about budgets and putting money where it needs to be. As one of those folks over the age of 60, I showed these before. These were the absentee ballot applications that were mailed out by St. Louis County, but as was posted in the chat, they didn't mail to everyone that was qualified. They mailed until they ran out of money. Okay. And so there are lots of folks out there that need this information and the things that we are working on.
you know, make sure that you reach out to people that you know to sign up through the Notary Hub and become a notary, so that if we lose this lawsuit, we've got enough notaries out there to make it easy for people to vote. Okay, there are lots of things that we can all do outside of getting out our checkbooks, which I do encourage you to do as well, because it's really important. So again, I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of your day to be here with us. A special thank you to Judge Wolf, Denise, Rory, Yinka, and Nicole for also being here. And thank all of you for the amazing work that you're doing to help make Missouri a better place. It's, as one of you said, it's an uphill battle, but we're just going to keep plugging away. So thank you. And for those of you that need to get off, feel free to do so. If you'd like to stay on and ask additional questions, we will certainly keep the Zoom open and we will keep the chat open. So thank you all again.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Denise, are you staying? I'm going to have to leave. We'll let Denise stay.
I can.
How's that? Okay, great. Thank you. Nice to be with you all.
Bye, Judge Wolf. Thank
Thank you, Judge.
So Denise, can you talk a little bit about, you referenced LEA decisions to close or consolidate polling places. I want to make sure everybody knows what LEA means.
Sorry. Local election authorities.
Thank you.
So,
we're not all on the same acronym.
I'm sorry.
So.
I live in that world, but you know, I mean, but it's really serious. I mean, like, you know, look at Wisconsin in April, where hundreds of polling places got consolidated to 5 in the city of Milwaukee, which, you know, holds the state's largest concentration of African-American voters. And then today, just today in Kentucky, hundreds of 180 polling places getting consolidated. I think there was one in the areas predominantly African-American precincts. And local election authorities are saying, well, we have to close these polling places because A, we don't have enough poll workers, and B, all these places that we used to have polling in, senior centers, schools, right, are not exactly pandemic-friendly polling places. And so we know that there's going to be some adjustments, but what's really critical here is, one, that election officials get the word out very, very early and through multiple means, because what happens is that people are used to going to the same place. They've been voting in the same place for 20 years. And if there's going to be a change, they have to be notified earlier. B, we have to be very vigilant to ensure that that the decisions on where polling places get closed and moved is not disproportionately impacting marginalized communities, including communities of color. And what we've seen around the country is that that's exactly where they are closing polling places.
Thanks, Denise. There was another question posted, should we be creating a strategy to get requests for absentee ballots to go viral, in terms of putting it out there, and how are we encouraging people to reach out and get these absentee ballots?
So there's nothing that says you can't give an application to somebody. And in fact, the applications are available online. I've been posting the link to the application far and wide on my social media feeds, on the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition media feeds. I'm emailing out to friends and family. So we can provide the application to people, even help them get those applications turned in. What we cannot do, though, is once they get those ballots and cast their ballots, only the voter or a person within 2 degrees of sanguinity, a close relative, basically up to cousins, can return that ballot for the voter or the guardian. But in terms of getting people applications, there's no reason that folks cannot print, make photocopies of those applications. There's nothing magic about the application itself. It doesn't even have to be on the actual form. You could just write the information down on a piece of paper and turn it in, as long as it's signed. And so there's nothing that stops us from trying to get applications into the hands of people. The constraint, as we've heard at the election official level, is that many of them just lack the budget to be able to actually mail those things out to any. They're gonna be challenged to mail them out to people who request them, much less mail them out to anybody that might be eligible for them.
And Denise, correct me if I'm wrong, but I am under the impression that they have had a record number of absentee ballot requests this year.
Already.
All of the elections.
Yeah, and we've only had, really one since the pandemic started. I mean, we had the presidential primary on March 10th, which was right before all the lockdowns started. And then we had the June 2nd municipal elections, very low turnout election normally. Election authorities reported dramatic increases in absentee ballots. And people are already getting ballot requests in for August and November. And by the way, there's nothing that says you can't get those ballot requests in early. In fact, I strongly encourage you to do so. They can't start processing them until 6 weeks before the election. So even if you submit a request for the November election right now, you're not going to get that ballot until 6 weeks before that November election.
Now, Denise, I know that St. Louis County is accepting the applications for all of the elections already. Is the city as well, or everybody?
Like I said, anybody can do that. Yep, you can submit an application at any time, but they cannot process them and send them out until 6 weeks before the election. So you can send a request in right now for November, but just know it's going to sit there in a pile until 6 weeks before the November elections.
Are there any other questions for Denise, since she is our resident expert who agreed to stay with us this evening? Patty, you want to unmute? I don't know if you have a question or not. Okay. I can read your lips. You said no. Okay. That's about all I can read, but that's okay. Anybody else have any other questions?
Yeah, there's one more.
Oh, there it is.
What is the deadline for ballot requests for the August election? Great.
That's a great question. July 22nd is the deadline for when you have to make your request to get a mail-in ballot. And here's the kicker with that. This is also one of those deadlines where the request has to be in their hands. It has to be received by 5 p.m. on July 22nd. So none of this like you throw it in the mail on July 22nd. It won't get there in time. So we strongly encourage you, if you think that, if you expect that you are going to want to vote, qualify to vote absentee or want to vote by mail, get those requests in as early as possible. It also really helps the election authority because they're going to get a ton, like they always do, at the last minute. And it's going to help them temper the onslaught of requests that they're having to process.
And I did put in the chat the email to St. Louis County. I don't know the city one, but to request your absentee for St. Louis County, I did put that email into the chat.
Ellen?
Yeah.
I have two quick questions. One, I haven't looked at the absentee form, but can you request a form for both elections on one ballot or on one?
No, it's
No.
forms. It's two different forms. It has
two different forms.
Yeah, it has the date of the election on the top, Patty.
I'm in the city, so it. Yeah,
I'm
okay.
assuming the cities are the same.
Okay.
And you can use
other-
any of the forms. You can use the form on the Secretary of State's website, but you do have to indicate which election you are seeking.
Okay.
And you can't do them both at the same time because
Okay.
you have to know which ballot to send you.
The other thing I was going to say was I just studied and passed the notary exam, and it's really easy.
Yay,
It
Patty.
takes maybe 45 minutes at the most. So it's very simple, and I encourage everybody to join in if we need to do that.
Have you gotten sworn
Wonderful.
in? Have you
No,
been
I haven't
sworn in
gotten
yet?
my commission yet.
Okay,
I'm waiting.
got it. Great. All right, any other questions? So again, thank you all on behalf of Access Missouri. Thank you all for being here. Julia, thanks you for your help. Vicki, thanks for everything you posted in the chat with all the links. If anybody has any other questions, check out the accessmo.today website. And if you have voter questions, go to Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, movpc.com. .org. Go there and you will get all the answers you need. So again, thank you all very
Thank you.
much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.